This is Bruce Callant speaking, who is the local board member of the Dakota United Nations Association. We're very happy today to have with us Dr. Frank P. Graham, who is United Nations representative to the India-Pakistan countries. We also have with us Reverend Ernshaw, local minister, and Dr. Kerr, president of the Huron College. We're going to ask Mr. Graham some questions this afternoon that we think will be of interest to the people of our local community. Dr. Kerr, would you care to start, please?
Yes, I will. Dr. Graham, we're certainly glad to sit down here together and talk. One question which I might ask you, which concerns all of us, what are the distinctive contributions of the UN to the world of men and of nations in the last 10-year period? And also perhaps you can indicate, should I say, one single outstanding contribution that we can hold before us as a distinct achievement.
Well, I would say that in my view, one of the main achievements of the United Nations is the fact that so far it has helped to prevent the beginning of the Third World War. During the last 10 years, as we look back, you will recall there were about 7 hot spots on the face of the earth where a local spark dropped in the global tinderbox might have caused a global conflagration. Now, the United Nations has been one of the agencies, and in my view, the main agency that has helped the nations themselves to prevent these hot spots from breaking out into a world war. There was a hot spot in Iran, in Palestine, in Indonesia, in Kashmir on the subcontinent of Asia, on the Korean Peninsula, and then more lately in the Straits of Formosa, and also in Berlin. Now, the United Nations helped to get the Soviet Union to withdraw its troops from Iran. That helped to cool off that hot spot. It achieved a truce in Palestine. You remember the United Nations sent out a great Swedish gentleman, Count Bernadotte, who lost his life as a mediator he was assassinated. He was succeeded by Dr. Ralph Bunche of the United States, who worked out the truce and the peace in Palestine. Well, of course, that situation hasn't been permanently settled yet, but at least it hasn't broken out into the Third World War, neither in Iran nor in Palestine. And then there was a struggle on between the 77 million peoples of Indonesia, or at least the revolutionary group among those people, and the Kingdom of the Netherlands. And the United Nations helped to achieve a ceasefire, work out a truce, and stop the war, and eventually help those 77 million people win their independence. Now that's the third hot spot. Third World War hadn't started yet. Then there was a struggle on between the 80 million people of Pakistan and the 360 million people of India in the Vale of Kashmir. And a truce, a team from 5 nations went out to Kashmir, went to India and Pakistan, and worked out a ceasefire between those more than 400 million people. Then in Berlin, where the Berlin blockade was imposed, and there was great danger of, if that had blown up right in the middle of Europe, between the Soviet Union on one side and the free world on the other, that might have been the occasion for the Third World War. Well, it was in the Delegates' Lounge of the United Nations in Lake Success where the Soviet Union representative, Mr. Malik, in a conversation with Ambassador Jessups, initiated the negotiations between the United States and the Soviet Union, which resulted in the lifting of the Berlin blockade. So that was another hot spot. Now, in the Straits of Formosa, when it seemed some months ago that a shooting war might start there, the United Nations was not the only agency, but it was one of the agencies, and was very helpful in behind the scenes and otherwise in helping to cool off the hot waters in the Straits of Formosa. And Dag Hammarskjöld, Secretary General of the United Nations, you remember, took the trip to Peiping and put in motion steps which, with the help of other people and other nations, to get the release of the American flyers, which also helped to temper the hot waters in the Straits of Formosa. Now, if you add those 7 things up and see that the World War didn't start in any of them, I think the United Nations has justified itself. If it had done nothing else but help, and it doesn't claim that it did the whole thing, but without the United Nations, there wouldn't have been any forum, there wouldn't have been any great global machinery for working out conciliation, mediation, good offices, to substitute talk and negotiations. Even shouting at each other sometimes, but it's much better for people to shout at each other than it is for them to shoot at each other.
Good.
So now that's one thing. Now, while that was being done somewhat more dramatically, there was a lot of quiet work going on undramatically, every day, year by year, month by month, and day by day. Why, some people here from Huron, the Wilsons, out in Karachi, in the technical assistance program, helping those people to produce more of their own food and produce more of their own goods so they can depend on themselves and be self-respecting peoples in a free nation as a part of the family of nations. And all that makes for peace and goodwill. So you have the United Nations carrying on what William James would call the moral equivalent of war in great campaigns against hunger, illiteracy, poverty, disease, colonialism, and the war system itself. Now that's the day-to-day work. And those are the foundations on which peace are built permanently. These other dramatic things where you cool off hot spots are emergency things which prevent a world war from breaking out right now or right then, and we pray right hereafter. But these quiet, undramatic, everyday things which involve people's education and their food and their health and their hopes of their children to live. Why, the Emergency Children's Fund of the United Nations is saving the lives of, over the years, of millions of children. I don't know whether you saw the Danny Kaye picture or not. As he went around the world looking at little children who are helped by the United Nations Children's Program. If the United Nations weren't doing anything else but saving the lives of little children who were certain to die from malaria or tuberculosis or some of the great plagues, these scientists and doctors and the knowledge that's been built up in the most advanced scientific countries are made available, the medical knowledge. All those things are the work of the United Nations.
Thank you, Dr. Kerr and Dr. Graham. Now I'd like to call on Reverend Ernshaw to point a question to Mr. Graham.
Thank you, Bruce. Dr. Graham, I'd like to ask you, what do you think of a country that withdraws from from the United Nations. Would you answer that for me?
Well, of course, the country has a right to withdraw. The United Nations doesn't have any compulsory powers. It's a volunteer organization based on voluntary cooperation. So if something is done that a nation doesn't like, it can pull out if it wants to. But I think it's better for a nation to stay in and hear discussions, even though it doesn't like the discussions, and have the freedom to state its own case, and then it can reject the recommendations of the UN if they want to, or it can refute the arguments made in the World Forum, rather than just getting up and walk out. I don't think it helps the country to walk out. I don't think it helps the UN to walk out. And you remember once the Soviet Union walked out of the Security Council, but they found they were losing by that, so they came back in. The Soviet Union walked out of the Security Council. France has now walked out of the General Assembly, but you notice they're not walking out of the Security Council. The next president of the Security Council is France. And they're not walking out, we're glad to say, of the Disarmament Conference. And I think they'll come back in the General Assembly.
Dr. Graham, there's another question that I wanted to ask, which is quite significant to people who live in South Dakota. You're aware, of course, that the state of South Dakota has a tremendous potential for the production of uranium. We are concerned in South Dakota that uranium is produced here be used to bless the world and not destroy it. Now, what is the work of the United Nations in making sure that in this atomic race, that which comes from South Dakota will be used for the helping of the world?
Well, I think the United Nations is the chief hope that atomic power will be used to help the world rather than to destroy the world. And I congratulate South Dakota on having this marvelous resource of uranium. When you go back, look through the past of industrial history, and you see that Great Britain rose to its position of wealth and influence in the world through coal and iron. And they say the state of Pennsylvania and Ohio and Illinois and the state of Alabama found a great source for the improvement of the health and life and welfare of the people of those states through coal and iron. Now South Dakota is coming into uranium, the new source of power in the world. And this source of power, with its tremendous potentialities for the self-destruction of peoples, the creative cooperation of nations for its use, not to destroy, but to build, to improve the soils of the farmlands, and help to cure leukemia and cancer as a great medical resource through the use of isotopes, and then to become a source of industrial power along with oil and coal and wind and water. We're moving into a new age. Just as the commercial revolution tied the world together, then the industrial revolution tied it together, now the atomic revolution can tie it together for weal or woe, for doom or hope. And as members of religious communions and as members of self-governing democratic nations, we hope that atomic power will be used to bless the world rather than to curse the world.
Thank you, Dr. Kerr, and Reverend Ernshaw, and especially you, Dr. Graham, for being with us this afternoon. I'm sure this information will be very worthwhile to the South Dakota people.